Hello. So earlier today, I gave a talk as part of a series of talks being run by the 100 Bomb Group Memorial Museum and Bishop Grosseteste University, and they very kindly invited me to talk a bit about my research. So I'm just going to rerun the talk in case anyone missed it. I'm just going to show my slides here. Hopefully they will pop up in the video too. And let's get started. In a 1986 speech made at the former 8th U.S. Army Air Force Base at Thorpe Abbotts, 100 Bomb Group veteran Robert Rosenthal told the assembled crowd that we have come home. This was our base during the war. We lived here, we fought from here, we flew from here, we spilled our blood here and died here. For Rosenthal, returning to the English base where he had spent 2 years of the war amounted to, in his words, a pilgrimage. This was a sentiment echoed by countless other 8th Air Force veterans who made the journey back to East Anglia in the post-war years. Many of those who returned to Thorpe Abbotts did so with heavy suitcases. Uniforms, medals, photographs, and wartime letters were among a few of the objects presented to the 100 Bomb Group Museum for display in the restored control tower. Today, the bulk of the museum's collection consists of objects donated by 100 Bomb Group veterans and their families. As a volunteer at Thorpe Abbotts, I've spent the last 6 months helping to catalogue some of the museum's more recent accessions. The items have ranged from a nightgown made of parachute silk to an urn containing the ashes of a 100 Bomb Group veteran, who had requested that his remains be brought home to Thorpe Abbotts. I believe that the donation of these objects, many of which are deeply personal, is evidence of the continued importance of Thorpe Abbotts to 100 Bomb Group veterans and increasingly their descendants. And if you watched Derwin's excellent talk last Saturday, you would have heard about the 7 dog tags that he and his team excavated from Thorpe Abbotts in 2017. 5 of these identification tags had been purposefully and ceremoniously buried by airmen of the 100 Bomb Group in what Derwin describes as a process of vernacular memorialization. Containing the deceased's name, blood type, next of kin, and religion, these tags were hugely personal objects. But what was perhaps most interesting about this discovery was the excavation of 2 additional dog tags in the same trench. The men who owned these dog tags didn't perish in the skies over Germany. In fact, they survived the war. Whereas presumably both men buried their tags next to those of their fallen comrades in a symbolic gesture before returning home to the USA. These finds show that even during the war, there seems to have been a desire amongst personnel to leave a piece of themselves at Thorpe Abbotts, a reminder that they were there. Aptly, one of the men who buried his dog tag during the war later went on to donate his whole uniform to the 100 Bomb Group Museum, leaving yet another part of his wartime identity at Thorpe Abbotts. But what makes Thorpe Abbotts so special? I believe that this desire for veterans to return to their old base is tied into the representation of Thorpe Abbotts as a home, not only as the 100 Bomb Group's wartime home, but as a final home. My talk today will explore 3 different ideas of homemaking. First of all, I'll look at the wartime history of Thorpe Abbotts and its transformation from a military standardised airbase into a home away from home for the men of the 100. Next, I'll explore the post-war notion of Thorpe Abbotts as being home to the ghost of the past, a haunted landscape imbued with the memories of the war. To conclude, I'll talk about the Memorial Museum as a spiritual home for veterans and their descendants, hallowed ground that is a site for pilgrimage and the repatriation of wartime objects. To start, I'll very briefly outline the historical context of Thorpe Abbotts Airbase. So between 1942 and 1945, East Anglia was home to the greatest air armada the world had ever seen. The friendly invasion, as it would become known, saw the arrival of over 500,000 Americans to air bases located all across East Anglia. These men and women would make up the ranks of the newly formed 8th Air Force. Their mission was simple: to destroy Germany's ability to wage war by bombing industrial and strategic targets in occupied Europe. An air offensive of this size would require the infrastructure to match. East Anglia was irreversibly transformed by the construction of over 40 heavy bomber bases as part of Britain's largest ever construction project, You can see the location of these bombers on the map. Hedgerows were torn up, farm buildings were torn down, and ditches were filled in to create Little America. Construction of the bomber base at Thorpe Abbotts, located near the town of Diss in Norfolk, began in 1942, and the location is pictured on the map. The airfield was built to a standard design known as a Class A airfield. The A referencing the A shape of the runway, the footprints of which can still be easily made out on satellite imagery today. The domestic sites were sprawled out over the countryside to the south of the runway, just beyond the image we have here. While men often griped about the persistent mud and cold, living conditions at 8th Air Force bases were generally more favourable than those encountered on most other fronts of the war. In a 1944 8th Air Force survey, 87% of personnel believed that they enjoyed better conditions than their comrades in the Pacific Theatre. Of course, this comparative luxury on base was in stark contrast to the deadly conditions that men faced in air combat. In 1943, the life expectancy of a tail gunner was just 2 weeks. As one airman put it, life in the 8th Air Force was like having one foot in heaven and the other in hell. The contrast between the experiences of air war and life in England reinforced the idea of the base as a place of safety and relative comfort in comparison to the cold, deadly skies. Another important historical intricacy to note is the fact that Thorpe Abbotts was only used by one bomb group for the duration of the war. The 100th occupied the base from June 1943 until late 1945. The histories and identities of both Thorpe Abbotts and the 100th Bomb Group are therefore closely entwined. And these 2 years would be long enough, I believe, for the men to put down their roots at Thorpe Abbotts. And this is really important when we consider the symbolic significance of the base today. One act that helped personnel quite literally feel at home was the domestication of spaces on the airbase. This process of homemaking was not only sanctioned, but actively encouraged by base commanders as a means of maintaining morale. Hanging curtains, building furniture, painting walls, even displaying personal photos of sweethearts, all amounted to acts of homemaking that fostered a sense of domesticity and belonging. War correspondent Alfred Friendly was amazed at the ingenuity of US soldiers during the war, arguing that GIs carry an American drive to build a place and a way of living that echoes the order, decency, and comfort of home. And we certainly see that ingenuity at Thorpe Abbotts, where personnel pitched in to decorate communal areas on the base using whatever they could scrounge from the airfield. The photo on the bottom left of the screen shows just that. It shows a corner of the officers' club at Thorpe Abbotts, and if you look closely, you'll notice that the ashtray just in front of the bookcase is actually being made out of an old bomb fin. Wall art and graffiti provided another means for personnel to claim, define, and relate to the materiality of the base. Talented artists in the group were commissioned to paint murals. The designs contained a broad range of themes. Disney characters and pin-up girls reflected the popular culture of the day, while crew names and mission tallies provided a visual and personal record of the group's achievements. Sergeant Thorrington painted a rural English scene onto the wall of the Red Cross Club at Thorpe Abbotts. The description of Thorrington's work in the official record reads as follows. The work is very simple and very lovely and very honest. Perhaps the most truly delightful part of it is Thorrington's own inscription, stating his theme, that to us this is a strange land with its fervent customs, a slightly different tongue, but a common cause. This quote reminds us that whilst the bases were often referred to as Little America, each base community had its own distinctive culture and traditions that were influenced by the airfield's location in England as much as they were by popular US culture. The Red Cross Club, where the mural was painted, was the embodiment of homemaking spirit. Red Cross aero clubs were present at every 8th Air Force base. Run by American Red Cross staff, the main purpose of these clubs was to offer a home away from home for the enlisted men of the base. I'd like to play a short video now, which features the memories of Red Cross director Erna Tawney, who actually ran the aero club at the nearby base RAF Flixton. But her experiences would no doubt have been similar to the women who worked at Thorpe Abbotts Club. And the photos accompanying the narration were actually taken at Thorpe Abbotts, so I hope they give you a flavour of the efforts that the staff went to create a home away from home at these clubs.
Oh, nice big Quonset huts. We had pool tables and a nice big huge room with 2 pianos for music, and in the evening they play cards or they just sit around and read. We had library books. We'd have dances. We'd figure a dance. We'd put posters around the local villages saying that we were sending trucks through at a certain time. We had a kitchen with some of the local British women who came and made donuts and made sandwiches and hot coffee. We had certain hours that we were open for the club. And of course they were doing air raids, and they'd get up very early in the morning, get the planes heated up and take off. And we would always be there when they came back from their flights. We never knew who was coming back and how they were coming back or what. It was very, very tense. But we always were there with sandwiches and coffee. But it was our mission to try to keep things cheered up. Our clubs were very important. It helped them through a very hard time.
Okay, so you can watch the whole of that video at the Marin History County Museum YouTube page, and I really recommend you do because it's fascinating insight into the work of the Red Cross women. Moving on. So there are countless ways that base personnel made themselves at home at Thorpe Abbotts. Not all of them revolved around the physical domestication of space. In some cases, just the establishment of familiar routines and relationships was enough to transform the base from somewhere the men existed to somewhere that they actually wanted to call home. Special services, which had officers at every base, organised a range of morale-boosting activities. Thorpe Abbotts had its own competitive basketball, softball, football and volleyball teams, as well as regular educational classes, with lectures on everything from bookkeeping to German. The Special Services schedule, along with other announcements, were published in the Daily Century Bulletin. This news sheet was pinned to notice boards around the base and encouraged a sense of community and belonging within the base's 3,000-odd population. Food was also important in raising morale and helping the men to feel at home. Unsurprisingly, British rations of powdered eggs and spam didn't go down too well. Many turned instead to the base post-exchange, where they could acquire imported American snacks and candy. There are also accounts of men sharing meals in their living quarters, using the hut's pot-bellied stove to cook bacon and eggs that they'd acquired from the local farms. Technical Sergeant Dewey Christopher even remembered shooting and cooking a pheasant to share with his fellow ground crew. And many, I'm sure, would argue that a house is not a home without a four-legged companion. It's no surprise, then, that many Americans kept pets on the base. Some, such as the famous Mo the donkey, were considered good luck mascots, whilst others provided comfort and much-needed distraction. There were so many animals roaming around Thorpe Abbotts by July of 1944 that an order went out reminding men to register their pets at the station surgeon's office, which I presume also doubled up as the veterinary office. As well as animals, personnel also adopted human mascots in the form of local children. For many of the young men who had siblings and children of their own at home, friendships with local families contributed to the domesticity of the airfield, whilst also establishing long-lasting connections with the local community that still survive today. I believe that these processes of meaning-making helped men feel attached to their base, an attachment that would endure long after the war ended. Of course, many men couldn't leave Thorpe Abbotts fast enough, and I certainly don't speak for every 100 Bomb Group veteran when I say that Thorpe Abbotts was a home away from home, because for many people, it wasn't a pleasant place to spend 2 years. However, for countless service personnel, Thorpe Abbotts was the place where they lived through their most intense period of their life. The base wasn't just a backdrop to their wartime experiences, it was a character in its own right. As well as various forms of homemaking, men's relationship to their base was also uniquely shaped by the proximity of death. Over 700 men of the 100 bomb group lost their lives whilst flying missions from Thorpe Abbotts. As the last place crews stepped out from before meeting their fates, Thorpe Abbotts would take on a spiritual significance as a final home. During the war, personnel lived with the constant fear that they or their buddies would fly out from the base, never to return. The collective anxiety of the ground personnel as they watched for the group's planes to return home from a mission was so profound and intensive that it had its own name, Sweating Out the Mission. For veteran Earl Benham, the idea that the control tower was a witness to these events is what makes the building so special today. Benham writes, "We who flew combat missions know the tower has seen us all. It has been there for every takeoff and landing we made. Now, in the dusk of night, we may imagine the tower sits quietly, possibly with sad thoughts of those who did not return." The idea of the control tower as a silent witness to the departure of over 700 young men who never returned to the base is part of the reason why the building has so much meaning today as a site of memory. The departure of the 100 bomb group in 1945 was sudden and, for many local people, earth-shattering. Where once there had been the chatter of Hollywood accents and the roar of B-17 engines, now there was only quiet. As redundant edifices with few practical uses, the airfield buildings would serve as static reminders of the Americans for decades to come. Paul Mean was only 12 years old when the Americans left Thorpe Abbotts. He recalled a visit to the old airfield shortly after the war, describing how sometimes there would be a certain smell as he worked some ground where engine oil from the plane engines had been pulled away, and it would all come back to me, what had happened in that place. Norfolk was dead after the Americans went. For schoolboy Paul, the material remnants of the base, in this case the old engine oil, triggered the process of remembering. Childhood memories that were no doubt amplified by the deathly stillness and quiet of the Norfolk countryside. In May 1946, shortly after the last Americans had left Thorpe Abbotts, L.J. Burroughs, an Air Ministry Works employee responsible for closing down the base, collected the last of his belongings and left his office at Thorpe Abbotts for the last time. Where once the roar of B-17s had pervaded the Norfolk calm, now there was nothing but the murmuring of wood pigeons in the swaying poplars. With no personnel left on the base, the weeds were already beginning to creep through the cracks in the concrete paths. Burroughs described the scene as he left the building. As I turned the key in the lock of the last building in use on the site for the last time and stepped into the waiting vehicle, Thorpe Abbotts was officially added to the list of redundant airfields. Only memories remained. In this last comment, Burroughs expresses the idea, and an idea that would become cemented in the mythology of Thorpe Abbotts. The idea that even after the Americans left the base, the airfield would still be home to the memories of the war. And these memories have often been described as the ghosts of the past, not least in historical books published in the post-war years, which referred to the ghost fields of East Anglia. These books presented the voices of veterans alongside images of the abandoned airfields. And this style of composition is itself a metaphor for the idea that memories are entwined with the airfield buildings left behind. The idea of the abandoned airfields as a site of memory is perfectly encapsulated in the next video I want to show you. This clip from the beginning of the 1949 film 12 O'Clock High shows an 8th Air Force veteran returning to his old base. Like the young schoolboy Paul Mean, the main character kicks a piece of oil, a patch of oil, and he experiences this onslaught of wartime memories. With this type of ghostly imagery and language, it's perhaps no surprise that Thorpe Abbotts has gained a bit of a reputation for being haunted. The most famous haunting is that of Eddie the Ghost. Eddie was supposedly an airman killed on a raid to Berlin who has haunted the base ever since. However, a glance at wartime records shows that Eddie is much more likely to have been an invention of 100th Bomb Group personnel, a ghostly tale intended to initiate new recruits into the mythology of the Bloody Hundredth and give the base a sense of history, like the countless haunted houses in the surrounding towns and villages of East Anglia. The invention of ghost stories was a type of wartime homemaking that has survived into the present day. Whether or not Eddie the Ghost still haunts the base, visitors have frequently described a ghostly presence at Thorpe Abbotts. While restoring the tower in the late 1970s, several volunteers admitted to feeling a peculiar atmosphere in the tower. In some cases, this presence even manifested into the sounds of ghostly voices and engines. All of the men agreed that the dedication of the Memorial Museum in 1981 brought about a change in the atmosphere, theorizing that, quote, the departed friends of the 100th are now finally at rest. But for 8th Air Force historian Roger Freeman, the ghosts of Thorpe Abbotts had not disappeared completely. In a 1986 speech, he predicted that on visiting the tower and viewing the objects on display, museum goers would, quote, learn something about those young men from a foreign land who once served there, and when they have learned, they will walk out on the field and they too will experience that certain presence which I maintain is there. For Freeman, it's the collection of personal objects and stories at Thorpe Abbotts that has the power to unlock the memories of the past for visitors. This was certainly the case for veteran Buck Elton, who visited the museum shortly after it opened. For Buck, the visit brought back a flood of his own wartime memories. I'll just read out this slide. One day while I was there, I went out to the tower alone. It was raining, and the low clouds raced by. I climbed up to the top where we used to wait for them to come back. I must have been there for half an hour, and then I swear I heard them all come back. Patrick, Adams, Schmallenbach, Barnhill, Knox, Biddick, all of them. I couldn't see them up there in the clouds, but their engines made the old tower tremble. One slow pass, and they were gone. I do not expect you to understand this, but you must believe it. I have the feeling they will return because they are being remembered. As both a memorial and a museum, the control tower and its collection inspires us to remember as visitors to the tower. For some veterans, the Memorial Museum offered the chance to process their own painful wartime memories. In 1983, a former 100 Bomb Group mechanic donated a watch he had found on a plane that had been badly shot up. Now, let's remember that the ground crew cleaned and repaired the blood-soaked and shot-up B-17s after they had returned from missions, experienced the true carnage of the air war firsthand. A traumatizing experience that is often overlooked when we consider the role of ground personnel. The watch that the mechanic found after this particularly bloody mission belonged to the deceased navigator, Lieutenant Harold Becker, who's pictured here on the right. The article accompanying the letter describes the frantic scene as ambulance crews brought out the body of Lieutenant Becker from the plane. The final poignant line reads, "The groundmen, waiting to get into the plane and make the repairs, watched silently." By donating an item imbued with the memories of that tragic event, the mechanic, no longer the silent bystander, was able to participate in the process of memorialization by repatriating the watch to its final home at Thorpe Abbotts. Like the burying of dog tags during the war, the creation of the Memorial Museum provided a focus for commemorative and personal rituals for dealing with loss. The donation of objects provides a way for veterans to lay their memories to rest, whilst in turn encouraging visitors to remember the sacrifices made by the men of the 100. It's this layered process of wartime and post-war meaning-making that has made Thorpe Abbotts a spiritual home for many veterans and their descendants. Even with the passing of veterans, the symbolic significance of Thorpe Abbotts as hallowed ground hasn't faded. Due to the work of the 100 Bomb Group Foundation in the US, and also the continued work of the volunteers at the 100 Bomb Group Memorial Museum, interest among the descendants of 100 Bomb Group personnel continues to grow. Many of these second and third generations have made the journey to Thorpe Abbotts, and many more plan to do so in the future. Like religious pilgrimages, these visits often follow a set itinerary, ending with a visit to the glass house at the top of the control tower. Looking out over the former runway and surrounded by the objects of their fathers and grandfathers, family members regularly claim to feel the presence of their loved ones. For some, such as the veteran's son quoted on this slide, the visit can even feel like a homecoming of sorts. Okay, so that's just a small clip from a video I made last year, and if you do want to watch the whole thing, it's on my YouTube channel. So, by furnishing the old control tower with personal objects and memories, the museum is in a way replicating the actions of the men of the 100, who decorated the cold, drab buildings with their own personal touches in a bid to feel at home. As both a memorial and a museum, Thorpe Abbotts provides a home for these memories and invites us to unlock them when we visit. In Robert Rosenthal's speech from 1986, he ends by thanking the museum for welcoming him and his fellow veterans home. Because that's what I believe Thorpe Abbotts still is today, a home. And I hope this talk has inspired you to visit Thorpe Abbotts or one of the many other airfield museums located in East Anglia. And I encourage you to support the work of the museum, especially in these difficult times. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below.